Good morning. That would have been a mistake to not grab the clicker, so thank you for that. So we've been talking about mistakes. Hopefully this talk isn't a big mistake. We'll be the judge of that. But I'm really excited to share some ideas with you. This is a brand new talk just for our session here. It's great to be in front of a group of people. So thank you for being here. JJ overstates my role with the company. I host webinars and I manage and produce that series. And as great as webinars are, this is an amazing Zoom interface that we have here today. Your video is all on. Thank you for that. You're all unmuted. Let me hear you. Okay, good. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to share some thoughts here. The slides and a bunch of links and references are available at markgraban.com/KaiNexus 2022. I made a mistake of not yet uploading the slides, but they will be there shortly after the talk, and I'll put that URL up afterwards and we can send it out. So since I'm making mistakes, we're going to talk about mistakes. That's why we're here today. Over the past 18 months or so, I've been a little bit obsessed about talking about mistakes. I try to be aware of my own mistakes, and I've talked to over 180 people in a podcast series that I called My Favorite Mistake. It might have been a mistake to name the podcast My Favorite Mistake, because if you go and search for it, let's say on Spotify, you get the Sheryl Crow song and all of the cover versions of the Sheryl Crow song, My Favorite Mistake. Go what? Go and search for? Oh, no. I'm not going to sing. That would be a mistake. Hey, Jeff, maybe you can mute yourself. Somebody mute Jeff, please. Who's the moderator? No, it's all right, thanks. But I've been able to interview a really diverse group of people from different countries, different companies, CEOs of fairly large organizations, CEOs of startups, entrepreneurs, retired pro athletes, entertainers, coaches, psychologists, and I've asked them all the same question. What's your favorite mistake? And I get a really interesting response from people, and I want to share some of the themes and some of the stories that come from asking this wide range of people that same question, because they all interpret it a little bit differently, but I'm going to share, to me, what I think favorite mistakes are. But at least half of the guests, before they get into their story, say something to the effect of this. Jen Welter is an amazing woman. She played professional women's football. She was hired by the Arizona Cardinals to work during a preseason training camp, the first woman to be hired as an assistant coach to work with a team in the NFL. And before she shared her story, and she had many mistakes that she talked about, she said, gosh, there's so many. Right? How do guests pick one to talk about? Tom Peters. Has anybody read any of Tom's books, management books? Legendary author, speaker, consultant. At the beginning of his episode, before he shared his story, he also admitted, I've made so many mistakes, I presume we've got a minimum of an hour and a half to talk about this. So I had him for 45 minutes, and a great story from him where he got fired, he thinks, from the firm McKinsey back in the early 80s for having long hair. Go figure. But getting fired from McKinsey opened all sorts of doors for him when his book, In Search of Excellence, was published. Greg Cody, a sports columnist with the Miami Herald, responded in an interesting way. Like a lot of guests, oh, that's a great question. I love that question. Greg Cody said, what an odd phrase. It's an oxymoron. Why would I consider a mistake something to be cherished and favorited? Well, it turns out he did have a story. When he was a young sports reporter, a pro soccer player in Miami basically told a bunch of lies and a tall tale about his family from Argentina and the Falklands War. You can Google it that's a long time ago. Greg was working there a long time ago. And he printed these lies. And it taught him a lesson, and he should have learned this in journalism school maybe. Always double check the facts before you print a story. So he learned from that mistake, and he's been pretty successful in spite of it. So what is a favorite mistake? I think there's a couple of things, and it could be one or all of these. A favorite mistake, it's something that leads to learning that maybe helped your career and maybe also your organization. I'll share some examples of that, including my own. A favorite mistake maybe leads to learning and reflection and improvement. That means you don't repeat the mistake over and over again. And sometimes a favorite mistake maybe is something that just leads to an unexpected positive outcome. So I'm going to share a story, because I get asked, sometimes people turn the tables on me. All right, Mr. Mistake Guy, what are your favorite mistakes? So one of them goes back to 1999. I took a job out of grad school here in Austin, major computer company. Instead of playing It Rhymes Like game, I'll just say Dell Computer. I was about to make the mistake of being overly clever there. It was Dell Computer, north side of Austin. I left that company after about a year and a half. It wasn't the biggest mistake I ever made, but I realized it wasn't really a great culture fit. I mean, I got to do some good work. It was kind of a mistake. I mean, I moved on, right? I mean, not all mistakes are going to derail a career. But the reason I call this a favorite mistake is that I met my wife there. Oh, thank you. Thanks for not being muted. That was nice. Now, please, 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 nobody tweet a picture here saying Mark Graban said his wife is his favorite mistake. That's not what I'm... Wake up. I want to make sure I'm trying to communicate clearly. It was I hope she's not saying it's a favorite mistake. But that turned out, thankfully for me, really well. One of my guests on the podcast, Ron McGill, he is a zoologist with Zoo Miami. And he told a story. What was his favorite mistake? He said he was a young zoologist, and he described that he was cocky, he got a little careless, and the crocodile that he was working with at the time bit his right hand and nearly took it off. Like, oh, that's a much more dramatic story than my little story about my job that I wasn't super happy with. Why was this a favorite mistake for Ron? Well, one of the nurses that was caring for him during his rehabilitation, a year later became his wife as well. Not the giraffe. A human woman became his wife. So look, there's a difference between happy accidents and life lessons, right? I mean, a bunch of happy mistakes might not really lead to success. There might be a cute story there. But I think there's a certain range of mistakes, of favorite mistakes, that impact us in a way that leads to growth and reflection and improvement. So my more serious work favorite mistake story goes back to about 2004. Like, I'm surprised they even had a digital camera around to take a picture of some of this work I was doing. But I was working at a manufacturing company, Honeywell. I was going through a certification, something they called Lean Expert. And I thought that title was a mistake for a bunch of reasons. But it was basically a Lean black belt program of going through training, getting certified, and that meant doing a project. So what you see pictured here is sort of the end result of what I helped put in place in a production area. Now, if you hear me saying the word I, it's kind of hinting to what the mistake was. So I was tasked with implementing something, whether the people in this production department even cared or wanted it. It wasn't a culture, even though they were trying to do lean things, I would argue it wasn't a lean culture, because it wasn't a culture that really valued or supported engaging the production associates. There wasn't really an opportunity to, let's say, shut the line down and really work with people, so I had to catch them in between the value-added work they were doing or pull them away from the waste that they were involved in. So long story short, I set up, and I cringe saying this, I set up a production kanban system that was supposed to tell some people when they should trigger changeovers, when they should produce certain parts. There were kanban cards. What was the batch size? I'm sure the math was correct. I had visual management. I'm like, oh, well, good, like that's fine. But nobody ever used it. It looked great, and the guy running the presses still used his own judgment about what the batch sizes should be and when he should do the changeovers, and they would still sometimes run out of parts. But I'll take some ownership of this, right? I tried to learn from this lesson. Instead of just bad-mouthing the culture I was a part of, I thought, I don't want that to happen again. I don't want to do improvement work that's not involving the people who do the work. As a consultant, I try to be really careful that nobody ever tries to put me in that position. I'm like, oh, we want you to just come in and tell us what to do. Why don't you just come in and tell us the answer? Go do it. Like, that doesn't work. It's not sustainable. So I'd like to think I learned from that instead of repeating that mistake over and over again. That wouldn't be much of a career, maybe. To go into different places and do the same thing over and over and to blame others. Like, nobody ever listens to me. Like, that might not be a great reflection. That might not be true. That might not be something to learn from. So I did write up that story and a few other mistakes, and 15 other authors, including some former Toyota people, shared stories in a book I published called Practicing Lean, sharing stories of mistakes from the early parts of their career, but mistakes they learned from. Like, this is not a pity party or saying, hey, let's all laugh at me and the mistake I made. But part of the mindset of this book was, I think, a reminder to people who are experienced. So, remember when we were new at something? We made mistakes. Let's be careful and not be too judgmental of others who are new to our field or new to our company who are also making mistakes. And so I invite you to check that book out. All the proceeds get donated to a patient safety nonprofit organization, which I think is a good cause. So a couple other points on defining a favorite mistake. It's not necessarily your biggest mistake. Like, I think I would get different answers if I asked guests, what's your biggest mistake? Like, that might just be kind of sad. Because a biggest mistake, that's really catastrophic or really soul-crushing might hurt too much for somebody to look back and really want to reflect on. A favorite mistake might be a biggest mistake, not always. But again, I think a favorite mistake is something that's big enough to stick with you. You remember it. You've thought about it, and you've moved on. I interviewed a friend of mine who goes all the way back to elementary school, Matthew Booz. He plays keyboards in an Ozzy Osbourne cover band in Florida. I should have taken a picture from that. That would be more fun. But Matt said, he was talking about his mistake. He said, why do I cherish this particular mistake? And I thought, that's interesting. Not everyone uses the word cherish. Greg Cody used that word. Maybe it's a coincidence. But the story he told, he said, it's a mistake I think about all the time, probably every day, probably multiple times a day. Like, he was leading a consulting engagement that wasn't really going well, and he didn't go to the boss for help, and he ended up getting kind of chastised for that after the fact. And so he learned as a consultant, as he learned as a leader, to create an environment where, I don't know if he was so much afraid to speak up or if he didn't think speaking up would be helpful, but he's reflected on that, and I think he moved forward in a really powerful, positive way. So again, I asked people, what's your favorite mistake? My first guest in the whole series, and if he had said no to this, I probably wouldn't have moved forward with the whole thing. Kevin Harrington from the show Shark Tank. He was on season one of the sharks who makes investment decisions and buys in the companies, and incredibly successful. He told a story kind of early in his career. It says here he's the inventor of the infomercial. And some of you might think, well, that sounds like a mistake. Why are you bombarding us with as seen on TV products? Think of like George Foreman grills and things like that. That's his company. But he shared a story. Like, a lot of people love to brag about their successes. But he told a pretty vulnerable story. He said, kind of early in his business, they had maybe 12 different products being sold through infomercials. And they were doing about $2 million a week in business. And he would come in on Mondays and let's see the total, let's see what's been deposited in the bank. And he came in one week and accounting basically said, hey, the bank's put a freeze on our funds. And it turns out one of those 12 products, unfortunately, had a really high defect rate, a lot of problems, a lot of returns, a lot of chargebacks. And the credit card company said, wait a minute, there must be fraud going on. And they shut off his cash flow altogether. And he said, this really put the future of his company in jeopardy. The thing he realized and the thing he learned from was that the credit card payments from all 12 products were all flowing through the same merchant account. So instead of blaming the bank, instead of blaming the manufacturer of these products, he realized that's the mistake. he learned and he adjusted. He needed to set up different credit card processing accounts for each product to not put himself at that sort of risk. So if he hadn't learned from that mistake when he was smaller and at a smaller scale, let's say that had happened later, that could have been even more catastrophic to him and his business. So I think it's great that he's willing to share that story, not so much from the standpoint of, if you start doing infomercials, don't make that same mistake. But I think it sets a really powerful example of being willing to share a mistake and to talk about the learning so we can think about our own favorite mistakes. I had a chance to interview actually in episode 2. Will Hurd, he was then U.S. representative from a district that stretched from San Antonio all the way out to El Paso. He was a 3-term U.S. congressman, and he told the story, and it's not uncommon for somebody to lose an election the first time they run. But the story that Will Hurd told, I think, was really interesting. So he ran for the first time in 2010. He won the most votes in the primary, but he didn't get 50%. So it meant going to a runoff. And even though his political consultants were telling him, hey, Will, the same strategy that got you this far doesn't win a runoff, Will thought he knew better. He ignored his consultants, he moved forward, he lost the runoff. And I really appreciate the fact that he didn't blame those consultants, he didn't throw them under the bus. He said, it was my mistake, my decision. He took ownership of that. Well, he dusted himself off, which I think is another trait of people who learn from mistakes. 4 years later, he decided to try again. He won the runoff in 2010. He got elected. He got reelected twice, 2014, 2016, 2018. And then he decided he had had enough of Congress and he didn't run again in 2020. So I think one of the lessons and the takeaways, as obvious as it might seem, I might be preaching to the choir on this, successful people learn from mistakes. I ran a poll on LinkedIn recently. I asked people, which statement do you think more accurately describes the most highly successful people you know? And only 13% of the people responding said, oh, they're successful because they make fewer mistakes. A total of 87% said they either make the same number of mistakes, but they learn more, or they make more mistakes and there's more learning. Now, that's not a scientifically, statistically valid survey. It's my followers on LinkedIn. And so again, I might be asking this question of a group that's more open to recognizing that we all make mistakes, and so we better learn from them. But I think there's an important question. Well, do organizations realize that fact? That successful people and successful companies maybe make more mistakes, but they learn from them. So we'll come back and maybe think about culture. But first, let's think as individuals. I think there's a powerful lesson that comes from my guests. We need to reflect about mistakes that we've made, but let's not overdo it. Let's not agonize over it. So Katie Anderson, who many of you may know or follow, said this in her episode. If you keep dwelling on a mistake, then that's counterproductive, right? There's a fine line, and I've had other guests say the same thing. We want to reflect, we want to learn, we want to think about what we can do differently, but don't take it so far to now you're beating yourself up for it, or we're dwelling on it or not able to move on. It's kind of a fine line, and maybe through practice, we can get better at that. I think there's another lesson about reflecting at the right time, like maybe not right in the moment. And so I interviewed a friend of mine from San Antonio, Lenny Walls. He's an entrepreneur. He's a retired NFL football player. He played for 5 or 6 years as a cornerback. And I thought it was really interesting, thinking about mistakes he might make on the field are going to be seen by 70,000 people in the stands or millions of people on TV. And he might make a mistake. He might turn the wrong way. He might make the wrong decision in coverage and get burned for a long completion. There's a next play to get up off the ground for. And he said, in sports, or especially at that position, we were taught to have a short-term memory. It taught me a lot about bouncing back from failures. And I love the way he described failures, that failures are stepping stones toward winning. Like, well, I think they are if we learn and reflect. And Lenny pointed out the time for reflection might be the next time you get to the sideline, where you can talk to your coaches, or maybe at halftime, or after the game and practice the next week. Like sometimes we have to dust ourselves off and keep going. But as you might think, there might be a parallel to continuous improvement. If we can't stop in the moment to really fix the problem, let's flag it, let's put it in KaiNexus to make sure that we don't forget to follow up when time allows. So there are, I think, individual things that we can do to reflect and learn about mistakes, but a lot of it comes down to organizational culture. A culture that supports learning from mistakes or not. So Dr. David Mayer was one of my guests, and he told a story. He's an anesthesiologist. When he was a resident, he was in the operating room running anesthesia. A pretty big name, powerful attending surgeon was doing the case. And so what David observed, this was not directly his mistake, the surgeon cut into the wrong side of the patient. That wasn't a bad decision. That's what you might call a slip-up, or just a simple human error in the moment. What compounded it, though, I would say now, was a bad decision. The surgeon decided to lie about it to the patient. Told the patient when they woke up, and Dr. Mayer said he overheard this conversation. The surgeon told the patient, hey, it's your lucky day. We found a problem on the other side. You got 2 surgeries for the price of 1. Like, wait a minute. When do you ever get something for free in healthcare? 2 for 1? Come on. But Dr. Mayer said his mistake was not going along, or was going along with the mistake. He didn't speak up. He didn't correct the surgeon. He didn't tell the patient what had really happened. And I appreciate that he reflected on that, but think about the culture that he was in. Think of the power dynamics. Was he really in a position to be safe, speaking up in front of the surgeon? Or no, I wouldn't blame him for that. But I think why he called this a favorite mistake, he shared the story and how it inspired him to a career as not just a working anesthesiologist, but as a leader in the patient safety movement. At MedStar, a health system out east, he's the executive director of their Institute for Quality and Safety. He was for a while CEO of a nonprofit called the Patient Safety Movement. That favorite mistake inspired him to try to create change in organizations that wouldn't put other people in that same position. And I think that's great. So let's talk about the culture at Toyota, though. I've reached out to my lean network and interviewed a lot of people who are former Toyota employees or leaders. And one of them was Asao Yoshino. I first met him, I got to learn from him in Japan in 2012. He retired after 40 years at Toyota. As he said in the podcast, I've made so many mistakes in my entire life, big and small. And he told a story as he was joining Toyota in 1966. Part of that orientation meant going out to the factories, going to the Gemba, learning about the real work being done. So that orientation included time working in the factory's paint shop. So part of his job was to add paint and solvent, 2 different chemicals, combined together into a tank. And one day people working there realized, oh, something's gone wrong. The paint's not sticking to the metal. Oops, what happened? They had to rework every car. And it turned out he put the wrong solvent into the tank. But how did Toyota respond? Mr. Yoshino said, nobody ever blamed me. They came to find the real cause of the problem. The root cause was not Asao Yoshino. He said they could have easily blamed me, but they didn't. They focused on lessons learned from the mistakes. He said his leader said, it's our mistake because we didn't give you detailed instruction. Or I think we could maybe imagine a situation where it wasn't properly error-proofed. If it was too easy to grab the wrong solvent, they would say that wasn't his fault. And they said, don't worry, we have to figure out how to stop the same thing from happening again. So think about a culture where that mistake gets hidden or covered up or blame gets pushed to a supplier or somebody else. you lose the opportunity to learn and to improve and to move forward. And it might have wrecked his career. If he got blamed or got a bad reputation of like, yeah, Yoshino makes mistakes, you can't trust him with anything. But thankfully, that wasn't the case. So Mr. Yoshino partnered with Katie Anderson, a great book she wrote called Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn. And in that book, they said, the only secret to Toyota is its attitude toward learning. It's people-centered culture, and that's about learning from mistakes and looking at the process, not just the outcomes. Now, thankfully, where's Greg? He's in the back. Greg buys into this idea. I think there are many KaiNexus cultural traits described in this talk and some of the stories I'm going to share here. So I interviewed Greg, and Greg believes the same idea. Whatever the number is, 85%, or it may be higher. 85% of defects or errors are caused by an inadequate process, and only 15% are true human error. So, because we are humans at KaiNexus, we all pass the prove you're not a robot test when we're online. None of us are robots. Adam. Our CEO makes mistakes. Oh, sorry to break that news to you, right? So Greg in the episode said, I don't have a problem talking about my mistakes. He was glad he had a month to think about the different mistakes. Again, not to embarrass Greg or anybody who's made a mistake, but mistakes people might learn from. Greg, as an overachiever, shared 5 different favorite mistakes in his episode, and I'd encourage you to go and listen to that or watch that. But before coming back to KaiNexus stories, I had a chance to interview Dan Pink, author of books including Drive, which we love that book at KaiNexus. His new book is called The Power of Regret. Mistakes may lead to regrets, and we talked about all of that, but Dan shared some research. He said, well, for one, his opinion, I think there's something healthy about leaders talking about their regrets with their team. And he points to research that says if you think sharing mistakes or regrets is going to make people not respect you or not like you, it turns out the opposite is true. Sharing that, having that vulnerability, leading by example of admitting mistakes and trying to create that culture, people actually like and respect you more. So I've already mentioned I make mistakes. In hosting the webinar series, we use checklists. This is just a small part of the checklist of all the things we do before a webinar, things that we're supposed to do after. Most of the things on this checklist are there because guess what? It was a mistake I made at one point. Or when Greg and I were doing these, it was a mistake Greg made. So part of our follow-up is we don't stop the webinar and say, hey, we got to go update the checklist. But we make notes and we come back and we add it to the checklist so we can avoid repeating that mistake over and over again. We have a different checklist we use on the day of the webinar. Now, I will admit, one mistake I've made is getting cocky about the checklist. Of like, I've done 10 webinars in a row without making any mistakes. I don't need to pull that checklist up. I don't need to print it out. That's when the mistakes happen. So the checklist is only as good as your ability to use it. But I want to share a couple stories, and it very coincidentally turned out that Deandra was the moderator of 2 webinars I'm going to talk about here. One was in February 2021. I was playing a role of like technical host, technical producer, webinar in the Root Cause Racism series. And we were getting toward the end of that webinar. It was going great. We were taking questions. And the people attending the webinar, this is kind of how I pictured them, and then boom. And I saw this on my side too. The meeting has been ended by host. I'm the host. I did no such thing. I didn't click in the wrong place. I didn't click anywhere. What happened? So this was kind of, I don't wear, especially in COVID times, I don't wear ties. But I thought this picture kind of represents my initial reaction of just feeling awful. I'm sorry, Deandra. I'm sorry to our panelists. So at some point, you got to figure out what happened. So I took a breath. I tried to be better about doing that and think, well, what could have happened? And I realized somebody else also had access to that account. We were sharing it. The problem wasn't what that person did. I'm not going to use names here. It was a systemic problem. And we called Zoom tech support and said, well, shouldn't there be a step that says, are you sure you want to cancel the webinar that's currently happening? And by the way, prove you're not a robot? And they said basically, well, you know, you're not supposed to be sharing accounts. Thank you, Zoom, for not kicking us off your platform. It was a structural problem. I had failed that other person by not being more proactive about making sure that couldn't happen. And I try to do my best here in terms of showing grace when mistakes were made, of not getting upset. What does that accomplish? Usually the person who's been involved in a mistake already feels bad, and that was the case here from talking to this person. I shared what happened with Deandra, and as an example of showing grace, her reply said, I'm happy you and the team were able to pinpoint the issue. Poor so-and-so. He. That kind of narrows it down a little bit, sorry. I'm sure he feels horrible. Please let him know I'm not upset, and we can classify this as an opportunity for learning and improving. So thank you, Deandra, for that. So a lesson I've taken away from this, and I'm going to try to be better about in the future, is when something goes wrong, asking questions like, how are you feeling? Are you okay? Before jumping right into the 5 whys, right? So the trap or the mistake I could make is my engineer brain kicks in and says, let's be analytical. Let's dive in. But sometimes you need to give people space to reflect at the time that's more comfortable for them. So there's a lesson here, and this is true for a lot of entrepreneurs. Small mistakes can prevent big mistakes. But if, and I'm reminding myself this, if you take action, and more precisely, if you take the right action, the right countermeasures after a mistake. Because this only very recently occurred to me. Back in October of 2020, previous webinar, again, Deandra, I'm very sorry. This is incredibly bad luck that this kept happening on your great webinars. During this panel, again, about 4 months before the other one, the same person thought they were joining the webinar as an attendee, and again, because they were sharing an account and they were logged in, they popped up momentarily as a panelist. And they realized very quickly, oh no, I'm going to bail out, and jumped out of the meeting, and really nobody noticed. Not a big problem. I told Deandra, we figured out what happened. He thought he was joining. No big deal. He'll probably just watch the recordings in the future going forward. So that was a countermeasure intended to avoid the mistake of accidentally joining as a panelist. It didn't solve the problem that then happened in February 2021 of starting a new meeting, killing the existing webinar. And I've reflected on this a lot. That was my mistake, not taking that small warning sign and thinking about, well, if the same similar thing happened, would there be a bigger mistake that could be prevented? And I did not. But we live, we learn, we move on. So let's talk a little bit about creating the culture. It takes effort, right? Changing as individuals, changing as a culture. It's not like flipping a light switch. One of my guests in the podcast, Keith Ingalls, he works for the Raymond Corporation. They are actually part of Toyota Industries. So they try to follow the same Toyota production system, lean practices and culture. As Keith said, as they're creating that culture, a culture that hasn't always been a Toyota culture, it takes a lot of work, but as with many things, it's worth it. It's worth the effort. So when we create that culture, there's a lesson here that people need to feel safe to admit mistakes. The related lesson is you can't just tell people they should feel safe if you really don't have a culture that responds and reacts the right way. I could preach all day long, you should speak up, you should admit mistakes. But if the organization has taught people that's really not a good idea, we have to be realistic in what we're asking people to do. Dr. Nicole Lipkin is a psychologist who I interviewed on the podcast. And she said, I think meaning leaders, you have to promote and invest in the behaviors that lead to psychological safety. You don't just say, I proclaim we're psychologically safe now. It takes effort. It's the behaviors that matter. It's not a one-and-done initiative. Billy Taylor, former Goodyear executive, really experienced lean leader, talked in his episode about I think meaning leaders, we use standards to shape the culture. What are the behavior standards of a leader? What do we say? How do we respond when a mistake occurs or when it's brought to our attention? Pictured here are some good friends of mine who work at a distillery about an hour west of Austin called Garrison Brothers Distillery. Donis Todd, pictured on the left, is the master distiller. On the right is Dan Garrison. He is, of course, one of the brothers, and he is the CEO and the founder of this distillery. So in the episode, Donis talked about, as a leader, he's really been intentional about creating a culture of owning up to your mistakes. I had a different guest use language that you might expect here in Texas, fessing up to your mistakes. But either way, fessing up, owning up. As you go through to the distillery, he said when people have made a mistake, you kind of sign your name to the spot as a bit of a commemoration of, here a mistake was made, but they learned from it, right? If you create a culture where people are embarrassed or driven by fear to hide mistakes, how do you ever improve? So in the episode, Donis shared a mistake he made. He was trying to age some bourbon. He thought the right amount of time. It turns out he aged it too long, and he said basically it was undrinkable, unsellable. So this was a mistake that cost tens of thousands of dollars in the whiskey they had to dump out. But as he said in the episode, thankfully, Dan has always been willing to give me the time to learn from my mistakes. He wasn't punished, he wasn't fired, but they learned from that mistake. They learned about some of the frontier, the boundary of how long you could age bourbon without over-aging it. And he said that in a way that mistake was an investment in future better products and better success. Dan Garrison, as the CEO, shared a story of his favorite mistake. He sent a nastygram email. He popped off and fired off an email to the CEO of Total Wine, which only happens to be their biggest, most important retail partner. So he says he's tried to learn from that. He recovered that relationship with Total Wine. But I think when you have Dan who's willing to admit mistakes and show grace to Donis, and Donis is willing to share mistakes and show grace to his employees, that leads to a culture of improvement, a culture of learning. David Meyer, formerly of Toyota, he's written books including the Toyota Way Field Book. In his retirement, he started a distillery in Kentucky, by the way, so that's why you see a bottle in front of him. But he talked about his time at Toyota and the mistakes he made, and he says Toyota at least aims to operate a no-fault, no-blame culture. He brought up an interesting point. He said kids are brought up with this idea of finding fault and finding blame. Keith Ingalls from Raymond shared kind of a similar reflection. I mean, we could get sidetracked talking about evolutionary traits, and unfortunately, I think there's kind of like this survival skill that humans developed over time of being able to deflect blame to somebody else, maybe quite literally a survival skill. So if we find ourselves in a situation where we're blaming ourselves for blaming somebody else, or we think we've made a mistake in how we responded to a mistake, I think we can show ourselves some grace. And say, okay, we're fighting some of our human nature, or we're fighting some of the things we've been socialized to do. As David said, it took me a couple of years to clear my brain of the impulse to blame workers. And I've tried to be mindful about this as well. I've written some blog posts that are linked to on the notes for today's talk. Of instead of saying, well, so-and-so doesn't care, or so-and-so is just bad at their job, to think about systems. And I fall into that same trap myself. It's a mistake I'm willing to admit. But Keith said, we have a process of unlearning, and we teach that mistakes are positive. Now, again, it's not that we love the idea that Donis dumped tens of thousands of dollars worth of whiskey. It really does make me sad. We can talk about that over a drink later, maybe, some of us. But it's not that we love the mistake happening, but we can embrace that, again, mistakes are going to happen, even with our best efforts to prevent mistakes. So here's, I think, the balance to find with lean. Of course, we want to error-proof and prevent mistakes, but guess what? Mistakes are still going to happen. So Keith talked about this process, again, of unlearning what we used to know and what we used to do. David said, our plant president at Toyota would walk around and ask, what have we learned today? Which is a different way of asking, what mistakes did we make? What new mistakes happened that are now learning opportunities? So again, coming back to Donis here in a second, and I think there are organizational benefits to being open about mistakes. There are personal benefits. One of Donis's reflections said, there's something about your character growing when you own up to your mistakes. So I think his initial motivation for trying to create this culture was one of let's not repeat the same mistakes over and over again. But one of his reflections was that this unexpected benefit is we tend to then grow as individuals when we can do this individually and then within a team. So a couple final thoughts. Again, as a reminder, we all make mistakes. By show of hands real quick, who can recall making a mistake at some point yesterday? A mistake that has stuck with you? Yeah. The day's early. Who's made a mistake already this morning? Right? You're not on mute, Banna. No, it's right. I think a healthy habit is not obsessing over every little mistake. If we make a typo, I don't think we need to send a Slack message to the whole team that says, hey, I made a typo and Word flagged it and I fixed it just so you're all aware. Okay, that might be taking it a bit far. I started an experiment maybe a month ago as I was trying to prepare for this talk. I'm going to keep a log of different mistakes that I make that I'm aware of. And that actually got to be pretty exhausting. I don't know if that's really a healthy habit, to try to flag every mistake. I was talking to my wife and I wasn't watching the GPS and I missed the turn. Okay, that's not a life-changing favorite mistake. But I think the important mistakes, again, the ones that have meaning to us, the ones that affect us enough to drive learning, those are the ones worth noticing and reflecting on and moving forward from. One of my guests here, Krista Hughes, and there's a link to the video. You need to just watch it. She's a nurse and a patient advocate. At the end of her episode, she said this, and I'm not going to try to do the accent, but picture a pretty strong Southern drawl. She said, well, if you don't think you make mistakes, then, oh gosh, bless your heart. And if you know what that phrase means in the South, it's not as nice as it sounds. And I asked her, and she's like, yes, I mean it that way. So if you don't think you make mistakes, it could be you're unaware of your mistakes. Sometimes a mistake doesn't reveal itself until days, weeks, months, years later. My wife pointed out right away, hey, you missed the turn. Okay, thanks. Sometimes somebody else can point out a mistake. Somebody else might say what you're about to do is a mistake, and you might think they're wrong, and maybe they turn out to be right, or maybe they don't. So being aware of your mistakes is one thing, and then I think being willing to recognize them, and I think there is something powerful about speaking up and sharing a mistake with others, even if you write it down and maybe try journaling it yourself. We all make mistakes. Some of us lead people who make mistakes. So again, I think there's one layer of this topic that's about how we act and respond with ourselves. And then if we're in a leadership role, I think there's a more important challenge of how do we treat others? How do we create a culture in our organization of learning from mistakes? Karen Ross, it's episode number 3. She told a story. Being able to turn a story about losing a suitcase in an airport had more meaning than I thought a story about losing a suitcase could ever have. As great as Karen is, talking about reflections and learning and countermeasures to make sure she wasn't going to ever do that again. She's the author of books including The Kind Leader, and I think reacting to mistakes with empathy, or she would use the word kindness. She said we all have the opportunity to lead with kindness. And I'm going to share a quick story about this coffee mug. You notice there's no handle on it. I decided I was going to order some coffee mugs with my podcast logo as a giveaway. And I ordered them from a company online. Of the 10 coffee mugs that arrived, 6 of them were fully intact. 4 of the 10 were broken. So I contacted the company. I'm like, hey, 4 of these were none of them were packed really well. 4 of them were broken. I'm like, okay, well, fine, we'll send you more. In fact, they sent me another 10. So I'm like, hey, free coffee mugs. Great. Of those 10, I think 2 or 3 were broken. So like, they're getting a little bit better. And then I bought more mugs from this company, and the breakage rate has always been about 20 to 30%. So I'm like, that takes time and hassle, and so eventually I switched to a different company that has managed to produce mugs and package them better. But Karen had an idea. I was telling her about the broken mugs, and we were kind of laughing about the irony of this. And she said, there's a Japanese practice of taking something broken and putting it back together with like gold metallic glue, and you make a piece of art that's unique and prettier than it would have been without the breakage. And so I did this, and I sent her one of those, and sure enough, it broke again in the mail. My mistake. So that glue works if you're going to just leave the mug sitting on a desk forever. Don't do that and ship it. But Karen, in a way only Karen Ross can do, she said, it's not broken, it's now a pencil holder. So thankfully, she turned that mistake into something positive. So final story, like, boy, I didn't expect this to be a talk about coffee mugs. Final story, and then maybe we can have some discussion here. So I've got this mug here, and it's not because version 2.0 of the mug, and I use this mug all the time, and I look at this. These are my mistake mantras, and I'll credit Karen for helping me think through this. As it says here on the mug, be kind to yourself. Nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. What's important is learning from our mistakes, and I need those reminders all the time, and hopefully those are helpful reminders for you, in your team, in your company. So with that, cheers and thank you, and maybe we can have some discussion or Q&A here. Thanks.